We have this winner-take-all kind of style of a contest in the Electoral College where it's winner-take-all for every state. And for those of us who live in New York, I think we often kind of forget the barrage of advertising that occurs during many election cycles because we simply aren't exposed to much political advertising for general presidential campaigns. And that is the case. So the candidates focus very intently on these battleground states, which have shifting identities from election cycle to election cycle. But in general, they represent about 1/3 of the population, and they get well over 90% of the election spending in those 1/3 of the population states. This means that we are minimizing the role of the voters in really the 2/3 of the rest of the country. And this is evidenced by the fact that even controlling for many, many factors, there's lower turnout in non-battleground states, perhaps because voters are just less a part of or aware of the election process. And if you believe, and this is a fair open question, to the extent that there is content, informative content in the political ads, you might also worry that the voters are less informed in these non-battleground states about making their decision. So what I'm showing you here then is kind of the status quo. This is the 2000 election. These are spending. This is GRPs, gross rating points, a standard kind of quantity measure for advertising that adjusts for exposure rates. And this is the Republican spending. On the bottom, on the x-axis, you see the state vote margin. So on your left side, you're going to look at Democratic strongholds, and on the right-hand side, these are going to be Republican stronghold areas. And as you can see, this very kind of clearly peaked pattern where there is a lot of advertising in these battleground states in the middle where there's a very small vote margin of victory for Republican versus Democrat, and then very little advertising on the sides where neither candidate expects to either win or lose. One candidate expects to win, one candidate expects to lose. Some kind of obvious choices, that is New York right there. So the Republican candidates didn't advertise in New York because they knew they were going to lose. And this is, of course, Florida. And if you look at the Democrats, it's a very, very similar pattern. Okay? So then a question then to consider is, what if we change the election itself? What if we change the style of the election? And a very common alternative that has been bantered around, especially a lot in the press, and is a direct popular vote. And especially after Gore lost the Electoral College in 2000, there was a lot of discussion in the media, I'm sure you can all remember, saying, if only we had a national vote, then Gore would still have won the election because he did win the popular vote. However, the problem with that kind of analysis is it ignores a very important thing. It ignores the fact that if you change the election, you're also going to change how candidates campaign and where they allocate advertising to. And I just showed you that advertising does in fact matter. It does shift voting outcomes. So if that's the case, then with a new allocation of advertising, we might see a different outcome to the election. So one nice thing about a direct popular election is that all states become in play. There's no more of this winner-take-all rule for any given state. Okay? And there's also a good amount of popular support for this. So a large majority of Americans have supported this in a number of polls. And there has been this national popular vote bill that has gained some momentum. I think I even saw an ad for it during one of the last presidential debates. And this leads to a simple question of, if we had a direct national vote, would this result in some more equal distribution of advertising? And kind of also quantitatively, what would actually happen? Would there be more or less spending? And if so, if a change, how much of a change? Would there be higher voter turnout or not? And how much higher if it were? So we developed a model, and I'm skipping over really 3 to 4 years of my life here, but and summarizing it for you beautifully in just a few slides. But we developed a model where we wanted to allow candidates to strategically interact with one another in a general election, where they are going to think about how the other candidate's going to respond to some increased amount of advertising simultaneously across a large portion of the markets in the United States. And we first fit that model to data that we observed, and then we changed the model and said, well, suppose instead of playing by the old rules, they play by this direct popular vote rule. What would have happened? What if this was the case? So this is the same data I showed you earlier, just layering on top the Republicans and Democrats. I just want you to remember that pattern. And this is what we would see is the prediction under a direct popular vote. And you can see it's a very substantial change. Two important points to note is that, one, if I just kind of maybe switch back and forth, you can see that on the sides, we now have substantial amounts of advertising in the previously so-called battleground states. This makes sense. If you open up, if you make New York or California or Texas, they stop remaining non-competitive because of this electoral college, we expect that candidates might want to advertise there because of the large population of voters. In contrast, in the middle, there was really a substantial excess of advertising. There was an overabundance of advertising in these battleground states that were getting kind of more than their fair share in a way. Okay. And you can also notice maybe a slight pattern if you see on the left-hand side for you that the blue dots tend to be above the red dots, and on the right-hand side, the red dots tend to be above the blue dots. That what you're seeing is what appears to be the strategy, that is, on the extremes, the candidates want to advertise even more in their strongholds. Maybe perhaps to drive out, to bring out the base as much as possible. We're still trying to explore these results further. To put it in numbers just very briefly, and then I'm almost done, put in numbers, if you draw your attention to the top, beforehand, only about 122 million voters were exposed to advertising of any sort. In the counterfactual here, that rises by about 30% to 162 million. Also, spending increases by about $60 million. And I know these numbers sound low. You have to remember this is 2000. And so spending increases quite significantly. One reason it increases is that you have many more voters who are eligible in a sense or in play for candidates to want to target. Another reason it increases, though, is because now a lot of larger cities where the cost of advertising is higher, candidates now want to advertise in these very expensive cities, and they need additional funding to advertise there, like the New Yorks or Californian cities of the world. How is it more equitable? Certainly, in terms of just the variation in advertising. So if you just look at the dollars spent per person beforehand, in battleground states, about 76 cents, and about 12 cents in non-battlegrounds. You can see that those numbers equalize quite a bit in the counterfactual. The standard deviation, the amount of spread in those numbers also goes down significantly. And maybe lastly, what happens in the election? Well, it turns out, at least the prediction from the model, is that Gore strengthens his win. He picks up about 750,000 additional votes. And nicely, turnout increases by about 1.5%. That's about 2.5 million people. So a lot of this makes sense from an intuitive standpoint in terms of thinking about how the Electoral College works and how a direct popular vote works. One of the kind of nice things about, or one of the contributions we wanted to say for this paper was really about the fact that we're putting quantitative predictions to it, not just saying about what direction would it go, but also how much would it change.